So now we're on to the key part of the evening, which is our panel discussion. And the topic for the panel discussion came from a conversation I had with Mark and Karen, which is around how fed up we are with these empty buzzwords that get used all the time around business. And disruption is one word that I'm particularly tired of. And I'm tired of it because it gets overused, and in most cases it's misused. And in fact, in 2016, so 2 years ago, The Guardian wrote an article suggesting that it was time to retire this word disruption, and that in fact it was a very empty buzzword coined by Silicon Valley. So if we move on from disruption, then what are we left with? So after the Cold War finished, the US Army came up with this term called VUCA. Who knows what VUCA means? Jane, would you like to tell us what it is? Lovely, thank you very much. That's an A star. So did everyone hear that? Essentially, VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the US Army felt that this was the world that they were living in since the Cold War had ceased, because they didn't really know what to expect from their enemies. So if we think about this now in 2018, I believe that we are living in this VUCA world, and that is our reality that we face every day. And so if you think about that, how relevant is disruption when there's so much change and uncertainty and ambiguity around us all the time? And so if disruption is irrelevant and it's just business as usual, then how do you stand out in such a complex, busy, fast-paced world? So that really is the topic for the panel discussion tonight. It's about how do you break through, how do you stand out, and how do you grow and succeed when there is so much noise and so much disruption all around you. So I'd love to invite Amar, Virk and Emma, sorry, I've just forgotten your last name, Emma Dawson up to the panel, and I will introduce them in an appropriate manner, so come up. Sorry about that, Emma.
Where do you want to sit?
Would you like to sit there?
So, thank you for coming up, and I'm not going to do a very long introduction because both Emma and Amar are going to give you their story of their journey and how they came to be here tonight and how they have led and been successful in this VUCA world. But let me start with Emma. So Emma is a chartered organisational psychologist, and she is head of talent development at a firm, which is a startup which makes finance easy for everyday people. Prior to that, she was head of global talent development at Dropbox and also running talent for LinkedIn. She graduated from the University of Auckland, gaining both a Bachelor of Commerce and Arts and also a Masters of Commerce. And then she went off to London and got her Master of Science at the University of London. On to Amar. Amar is the product strategy manager at Facebook. He's very new in this role. It's been 4 weeks now. And prior to that, he was at Uber Eats. He graduated from the University of Auckland with a degree in electrical and electronic engineering. Prior to starting at Uber, he also worked at Parthenon and Symphony Commerce, and he did his MBA at Cornell University. So I'm now going to ask Emma first to talk about her journey and how she got here. Then Amar will talk, and then we'll open up the audience for questions of our panelists.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So I'd probably start off around, I would say, coming out of high school, I'm not somebody who was super passionate about education. I think that for me all changed when I went to university. And I came out of school, I spent a year in Costa Rica having this sort of adventurous year, and then I went back and did my BA BCom. And it was actually towards the end of that period, I enrolled for a Master's in Organisational Change and Innovation with Dal Kolb and Deb Shepherd. And I think it was really that experience where I found what would be my career path. And in some ways, I'm actually a very boring person because I feel as though I've been on the same career journey my whole career, and I love it. But I will tell you, the thing that really took away from that experience was we had this amazing opportunity to go and work with a couple of companies that were going through a merger. And the focus that we came in to look at is how are we going to integrate the cultures of these organizations in this merger? Because as we know, it often comes, that can be the make or break of a merger, the people, the culture. And so I got to be part of this experience about like how are these cultures different? What shared values, shared experiences do we have? How do we make people feel included and engaged? And I feel that experience was then the essence of what I've searched for in my career. And so I finished that experience. I went over to the UK, and I was, of course, instantly disappointed because you can't immediately out of university get this amazing consulting role doing that kind of work. So that was a bit of a downer. But I did end up working sort of very quickly in HR, and then I actually spent a little bit of time in recruiting, a recruiting agency for about 6 months. I was so bad at it. I spent a little bit of time then working with a consulting company where I was doing something with like research and selling consulting services, and I was so bad at this whole thing. The whole thing was painful for me. I was doing all these cold calls, and every moment was painful. But I did come away from that experience having a much better understanding of building relationships, selling skills, how organizations work. And so that even though that was a bit painful, it's something that I've taken with me. And then following that, then I was very much on my sort of organizational development learning path. And I spent a lot of time in consulting. I worked in law firms. I then worked with like insurance. So I worked for Prudential over in the UK. And that's a 170-year-old organization, so I've had that experience of a much slower kind of moving organization. And then I met my husband in the UK, and we moved to the Bay Area, and that's when I started at LinkedIn. And I feel like that sort of started like an addiction for me, which is these like fast-growing, crazy companies with high levels of uncertainty. And for me, my career essentially since then has become all about like going into these environments, figuring out what is important, getting really close to the business, and then scaling out the learning and people component for these organizations. So that would be like a quick TLDR on my career to date.
That's great. Thanks, Emma. Amir, your turn.
All right, so my journey, I guess, starts when I moved to New Zealand for undergrad. I got an electrical engineering degree, and I think somewhere in the middle of it, I actually worked with, coincidentally, Professor Kolb, and that sort of sparked off my interest in business, and that I still finished the degree, went to work for Becker, which I'm assuming many of you in the room are familiar with. Worked for Becker for a couple of years, but that never left me at the back of my mind. So it's somewhere along my journey at Becker, I decided that I had to shift into business from engineering. And that sort of sparked off the first quest, which is, I guess, business school made the most logical sense. And I was also excited about tech, and I've always been excited about tech from a very, very early age. So I knew it had to be business and it had to be tech. And so I should move to Silicon Valley, and that should be the place. And so that sort of became the path where, while I was at school, I went to work at Amazon, and then graduated and went into consulting. And the reason I did that was I think I got caught up in the general, I guess, wave at business schools around consulting and banking, and I figured I should give this a shot, and I did for a year, and I was miserable, and I quit exactly at 1 year and 1 day. And that was largely because I had a bonus to keep. So I quit, went into a startup, and I decided I should start right at the bottom and try and learn what this whole startup thing is. And at that time, as I sort of look back, I think I didn't know anything about startups. I just knew they were cool, or at least everyone kept telling me they were. And so it was something I should go check out and learn along the way. And now I think, fast forwarding maybe about 4 years, 5 years, I have a better sense for them. At least now I understand what makes for a good startup versus a bad, and I guess what the differences are. But anyway, I went to that startup, worked there for about 2 years, did a bunch of different things as you do in startups, and then got the very good opportunity to join Uber Eats in its early days. That was 2016. And I led a strategy team focused on North America and a North America business, and did that. And as you pointed out, I guess 4 weeks ago, I moved over to Facebook.
Great, thank you both very much. So I hope you've all got some questions to ask our panelists. So while you're thinking of them, I'm going to ask them a couple of my own. So when I introduced the panel, I started talking about how I think the term disruption is overused and misused. And what I'd love to know is what you both think of that term. Is it still relevant, or is it just the way business is done now? Emma, how about you?
Okay. It's very interesting. I do think it's been a buzz term for a long time. We've been very focused on change and things like that. I don't know if we focus on creating value as much as we need to. Like one thing I would sort of say is like, Jeff Bezos, I think he's got a really interesting view on this. He'll talk about how people always say to him, what's going to be different? What's going to what's going to change? And he actually sort of said, like, the more interesting question is what is actually going to stay the same? Because if we can really get clear on what are the things at the core, we can really be building like sustainable businesses, long-term businesses around those core things. So I thought that was a really interesting insight. And I know we're going to talk more about this, but I think, when I sort of think about the core, I think about people and sort of a lot of the things along those kinds of lines.
Lovely, thank you. How about you, Amir?
I think you've rightly pointed out. I think disruption's been around for a very long time now, and I think a lot of people understand it, especially since the first theories, I think, came out about 2 decades ago. And now I think it's just the way things are done, and in particular, perhaps in Silicon Valley, it's exacerbated even more because that's just the nature of business here. So I don't think it's as relevant perhaps anymore.
Okay, that's great. And then something which I'm curious about, because this is often a discussion and we hear it a lot, particularly in the media, is a real focus on increasing the number of STEM graduates we have. And yet I often think if we're moving into a world of artificial intelligence and machine learning, that what is the role of the humanities and the arts and more the people skills and those other learning disciplines that we have? And I'd love your thoughts on what we need to really be successful in the future, when some things will be staying the same, but a lot will be changing. And when you think about talent that you're going to need in the next 5 to 10 years, where do you think it's going to fall over that line?
Oof.
Emma, would you like to start? So this is more your field.
Making you do the next I think this is an interesting question. I think at one level, in terms of like where the job growth is, it does feel like a lot of that is in STEM. I think when we talk about skill gaps and like what organizations are noticing, I think there's a few different tiers around that. I think there's like basic job skills, which is actually more around like the collaboration, being able to be a great team member, those kinds of things that they're actually saying are missing. Deep technical skills, and then they're saying the industries are saying we're wanting more STEM graduates. So I think there's that side of it. However, I do think there's this also this thing about, like, if I think about what I like to see from young people coming into the workplace, I think it's a few different things. I like to see the ability to, like, critical thinking, problem solving is a big one for me. The ability to work across functions and influence, and I include like conflict resolution in that as well. And then I think the third one is resilience. And so I think some of those things have been like traditionally anchored around like the liberal arts and the humanities. But I actually think if you zoom out, it's much more about how you teach these subjects as opposed to purely what they are. Like I think if you look at, for example, Stanford, for example, and the way they teach engineering there, it's a very close relationship with the design school. So people are learning design methodology. I mean, through that, all the scientific method, all of those kinds of pieces, I think are sort of anchoring towards those skills that I'm talking about in terms of what we'd love to see in the workplace.
Great, thank you.
I have very little to add to that.
Oh, really?
That's such a good answer.
And you agree completely?
Yes.
That's very good. Okay. We'll come back to you on something else.
I'll take the more technology questions.
All right. So does anyone have any questions in the audience? Okay, we'll start there and then to you, Stuart. Regina, there's a mic coming.
Oh, all right. Thank you. So just to put everyone in perspective, I graduated from University of Oakland in 1985. Yes, I know, most of you weren't born yet. But I'm very, very pleased to hear you, Amar, because I want to share something with you. When I came from New Zealand to the United States, I worked for startup companies. Silicon Valley wasn't what it is today. Every single company, Sun Microsystems, Adobe, and you name it, were tiny little trailer parks. So when the big companies came and bought us out, back then in our early 20s, all we cared about was money, which is no longer true. I'm over 6 decades, so it's no longer true. But hindsight, obviousness. I don't think that, I mean, they had this service. We call them ACE, ACE, Achieving Corporate Excellence. And what they did was they shut us up in a room for 3 days. We were only allowed to go home to eat. and sleep. They provided us breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And they taught us how to read, how to write, how to speak, how to align our value systems. They taught us the personality quadrants and all of those things. Personally, 30 years later, I don't think it did what it was supposed to do. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I have a lot to add to that actually, because I think I think it's a little bit of, I think we have a bit of a skill crisis actually here with regard to like how fast technology is moving and how quickly we actually need to develop skills to keep up. And I actually think we've been doing learning and development in the wrong way for a really, really long time. And I feel like I experience this every time I go into an organization. We have this kind of fixed mindset about what learning and development should be. But in actual fact, like we have to shift away from the, you'll hear like the Apple University and things like that, which is actually very separate from the work that we're doing. And so I think like how do we bring those skills into like the everyday? Like one of the trends at the moment is around micro-learning, like these very small like nuggets of learning that are actually happening where the work is happening. So it requires a different type of learning professional, people who are really more like process improvement consultants. Like I see there is an issue with change management here. What is the nugget learning that needs to happen there? And I think it's only if we can get to this kind of state of like learning really embedded in the job, in the work, it's a constant thing that we're constantly doing, that we're actually going to be able to really keep up. I think what you're describing for me, it sounds very separate from the work, which can be really challenging. It lacks context, in terms of the way that you're experiencing it.
So Emma, I'm interested to get your view, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. When you think about this learning in the moment, I think of it like just-in-time learning.
Yep.
You get what you need to know at that time you need it.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about that approach, how would you apply that to learning at a university?
That's really interesting. I don't want to overstep my...
It's just an opinion.
And I think like if I take it back to my personal experience, I mean, one of the most powerful experiences I had was where my learning in the classroom at the university was then taken out to work in an organization. I think that is a real example of my skills being applied in the work. So I think, and I know the business school does that a lot, but I think that is an incredibly exciting experience. What it also does is you leave those kinds of experience very confident to be able to replicate that in the workplace. Like you've just had a very real, tangible experience. Like it's not abstract or academic. It's really helping with that integration that's powerful.
Great. So it's real, it's tangible, and it's based on a real experience, which is exactly what you want at your workplace.
Yes.
Amir, do you have anything to add to that?
The university question, or the one before that?
Take your pick.
I think Emma's absolutely right. I think more and more, I look at what's happening at Facebook right now and some of the courses and the learning material we have. We spend an inordinate amount of time just making sure that we have access to courses that people can take just in time, if you will. And I think that is perhaps the way of the future in some ways at least. And I think universities still have a very, very important role to play, and more so in particular disciplines than perhaps others. Engineering, for example, is very clear that engineering by design is application-based from the very beginning, and you just take that over to your workplace and you continue doing that. So I think for some courses, perhaps it's more relevant and still stays relevant. For others, maybe it'll have to morph itself as time progresses.
Okay. Thank you. Stuart, your question.
Mm-hmm.
Wendy partly asked my question, so I'll speak sternly to her later. But if you reflect back on your university experience, you've talked a little bit about the workplace learning piece. But if you think back, which I don't think is that far long ago, looking at the peer review, but if you think back to that university experience, not just in a career context, but think about the rest of your lives. What could we have done better to prepare you for your careers and your lives than we did?
Interesting. For me, I think there were a few things as I reflect on my time back then. And it's hard for me right now to distill how much of this was my own doing versus what the university could have done. So I think, for example, if I look back, I could have done more, perhaps. and maybe some of the onus lies on me. But I think things that would have been helpful, for example, when I was looking at business schools, again, I think there was just a dearth of information out there and people to reach out to. And I didn't even know how to reach out to these people, and I didn't know how many of our alums were out here, for example. Like, for example, Emma was clearly ahead of me, and I could have reached out to her and sought her advice, but I didn't know how to do that. So I think creating opportunities like that, one. The second thing that I think schools in the US, for example, do very well is bringing a lot of external speakers into classes and making that as relevant as possible, or as up-to-date, if you will. And I think we did some of that in some classes, but perhaps more of that would have been helpful, because I think that really brings to life everything you're learning. And it sort of helps you connect the dots between what you're studying in academia or in university and to what someone is doing on the job at that very moment in time. Those are two that stand out in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, I'll say one other. I'll talk about something that could have been done differently. But another thing that I feel very fortunate about, though, is, and Nashika's had the same experience. But working with Dal and Deb, and they've actually kept in touch with us our entire careers as well. So they've remained mentors to us, which is wonderful. But I do think it's very challenging sometimes with university, because, and I alluded to this earlier on, is this big disconnect between what you get to think, the types of problems you get to navigate versus where you need to go into the workforce and what is then expected of you. It's actually quite a different thing. And I feel like it took several years for me to be able to get to that point where I was really doing that kind of work that I'd had a taste of in the university. So I think there's an element around what is it really going to take, like the resilience, really establishing your network very, very quickly. How do you build that network while you're at the university? Because I think your network is such a big part of what roles and how you progress and who you get to work with and things like that. So I think that's a big thing. And then there's also this element of like, how do you intentionally manage your career? Like, what does that really mean? And like, Reid Hoffman wrote this great book called The Startup of You. And it was a really cool mindset. It's like treating yourself as a startup. Like, what's my plan A? What's my plan B? And I'm just, what does that look like? How do I make myself marketable? What's my brand going to be? And I thought that was a really good way of thinking about it, because I think I think it's hard to come out of university and then start thinking about it. It almost needs to be something that you start exploring and navigating at least 12 months out before you go into the workforce.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Emma, I think that point about treating yourself as a brand is even more relevant for today's Gen Z. We all know about the gig economy, how they're going to have to really start selling who they are as well as what they do. And I think that's quite a shift that we're going to have to navigate with them through that. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, down the back.
I was just a little curious on what you guys' thoughts were. A little while ago, one of the founders or high people up at Sequoia was talking about how Silicon Valley's gone soft with their snacks and nap rooms, and that in order to continue this kind of path of innovation, that we need to be more like China and work way harder and stay up all night. And so I'm curious on what your perspective on that is.
I mean, I'm kind of aligned to that. Like, I think a lot of that stuff is kind of window dressing, like all of that. I think a lot of these, I mean, don't be fooled. I think a lot of these companies are really being pushed and challenged, and leadership is hard in these companies at the moment, because one of the things that people are really expecting is they want a sense of purpose, they want to be connected to the mission, they want to be communicated with actively, they want leaders who really walk the talk. So I think, like, yes, there's all that sort of softer stuff going on, but I do think leadership, there's high expectations of leadership teams at the moment, and I think that's where I certainly, like the company I'm in at the moment and previous companies, that's where they're really investing their time to get right, and I think that's the thing that really engages talent. I think part of that focus on the longer term and the mission and that piece has come with it being an incredibly tough talent market. Like, we look at a lot of candidates every time, and everyone's got multiple offers on the table. I heard Facebook's doing like 100K sign-on bonuses for new engineers. Like, it's really, really crazy. So So
Don't look at me. I'm glad she
I
specified
probably should have
engineering.
chosen another company. But yeah, it's really competitive, and people are looking for that purpose and meaning in their careers.
Anything you'd like to add about what Emma's called the window dressing around these types of benefits?
I do. I mean, the way I think about success for myself and the way I've always thought about it, I think my life equation has been smarts multiplied by hard work multiplied by luck. And I think if you put that in perspective, and I saw this at Uber to some extent, people were working extremely hard. And some of that was just driven by the fact that our business model demanded it. The stage of the company demanded it. It was just going through explosive growth, and there is no other way because the business was in some ways just falling apart and people were barely holding it up. And so I think there is some truth to that, and I think there's lots of projections and lots of studies around how China could at some point catch up, if not exceed, especially in some verticals where they just have an upper hand from a data standpoint and a bunch of other things. So I think that is true to some extent, and I think the rest comes down to the kind of work and the business model of the company.
Thank you. Another question down the back.
It's more a statement than a question. So I met with Jane earlier today, and she was talking about how do we address the challenges of the university moving into the workforce. And I have done startups in the Bay Area. I worked for Microsoft for a while. I worked for Yahoo. I now work at Oath. And we were talking about managing millennials. And my response was, we've all had to change incentives. So it used to be like the 401k for people my age was great. There was matching, and it's all moved to free breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And my response is, it's appropriate because we're asking it of the employees. And so, for example, in the Bay Area, traffic sucks. I get on the road at 5 a.m., 5:30 every morning, and I work, and I try to beat the commute home in the evening. The statement about the need to get purpose is absolutely true, but it's almost table stakes now that if you're demanding people are at work 12 hours, 14 hours a day, you better be feeding them breakfast, lunch, and dinner because you're demanding so much of them. And so one of my observations is that you always talk about work-life balance, is it needs to be put against the fact that we're asking so much of our employee base. And so coming back to what does the university need to do in this environment, my observation was that they need to get them ready for the fact that so much is going to be demanded of them, and that it needs to move to a more project-based environment in terms of setting them up to actually get deep in terms of what the employer will demand of them in this environment.
I think that's a really relevant comment, and I think in my past lives I've been involved in startups, mainly in the UK, and there's something about, you can see when the employees are work fit and they're resilient and they're ready to take the challenge and ready to take the risk, and then you can see those employees who clearly aren't ready for it. And it's a debate that we have at the centre, which is what is our duty of care to get these students ready for that future of work, which we know is going to be very different certainly to when I started work. Just another comment which I'd like to make on a very cynical note is I remember when, this is showing my age, I used to work for Apple a long time ago when their share price dropped to $15. So it wasn't a good time, right? And that was when the fruit baskets came in and all of these other trappings. But what we started to understand is that on that Apple campus, they wanted you to stay there, so they entrapped you. So there's always another reason why they have all of this window dressing there if you have more of a cynical lens on it. But I think there's something really brilliant in what you've said about purpose, and certainly what we see with the students coming through. Many of the ideas that they put up to us are social enterprise, it's social innovation, and they talk about the triple bottom line. So it's around purpose, it's around passion, and it's around profits and people. And I think that's been a real shift in the last 5 years. And I think you talked about plastic before, Stuart. There's something about this generation that really wants to make a difference in the world, for the world, not just for themselves. Any comments you'd like to make on that?
Nope.
I think what I notice with a lot sort of the younger generation in the workforce is also this like I'm just trying to think in terms of like what's needed from our managers. I mean, there's a lot more of this sort of one-to-one coaching, development, a lot more of an expectation in that kind of unique career path. So, and I think that's interesting. So I think there's a lot more of, and they talk about this a lot at LinkedIn actually, but this balance between like the aspirations of the individual and the aspirations of the organization, and how do those come together? Whereas I think traditionally it's been like, what does the organization want? And we'll kind of like meet those expectations along the way. It's definitely not that. It's a lot more complex now as a manager or as a leader to manage the different needs of the different individuals in the team and organization.
Indeed.
Hi, I'm going to take a quick sec to just introduce myself again. I'm Gia Punjabi. I'm the Alumni Coordinator Volunteer for the San Francisco. Please feel free to come say hello if you have any event ideas or if you just want to get involved around here. My question is kind of to both of you, and it was inspired by something you mentioned. You mentioned that a piece of work that you did was get into a corporation, especially around the merger time, and understand the culture and quickly figure out what needs to be kind of done to merge the two. Kind of a broader question on how do you figure out what the culture of a company is unless you're like seasoned about 6 months in. I mean, I just don't know. Like, what do you kind of do? How do you do that? I'd love to hear from both of you on that. Thanks.
And maybe I should go first because I'll have an unsophisticated answer. So the way I think about culture is I think culture is perhaps two things. The stuff you can see, which in Silicon Valley at least is the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the stuff that you can't see, and that's the heart of it to assess. And I think of culture in that context as the habits an organization has. So much of that for me is how do people go around, what are the formal and informal norms within the company? How do people interact with managers, and I guess how do managers interact with employees, and how do you run meetings and things like that? So what are the things that people care about? I mean, is the office packed at 5:30 or 7? All of those things. So some of that, I think, it's hard to assess all this from an interview alone, so that's why I try and do multiple visits if I can, to try and get at this, and I also ask a bunch of people. So when I took the job at Uber, I think I'd spoken to, by the time I accepted, maybe about 25 people in the company. And that's not counting my interviewers.
No, I think that's a really good point. Like what you can see, it's all those artifacts are all part of the culture. I think like an interesting discussion that's happening at the moment around culture is this different, we've had this language around culture fit for a long time, and now we're moving to this language around culture add. So how do we think about diversity and inclusion and things like that? And because we've actually seen that when we're so explicit about what this fit is, it's we're not getting diverse people. It makes total sense. And we also have this challenge around how do we make the implicit explicit. Like, say for example, even your journey going from like Uber to Facebook, there's actually a lot about tech companies and how they run and how it works. When you start bringing in candidates from different industry, different states, different countries, there is so much they don't understand about that. And it's very hard to set people up for success unless we can be explicit about this. And we're actually having this conversation at the moment around okay, so if we talk about culture fit and culture add, it's okay to have some of a fit. And so, for example, we've identified humility and agility are probably our biggest things for us at the core. And now we're just defining what are the add? How can you be successful here? Having real transparency about what do we reward in terms of performance, recognize all of those things, so that we can attract more diverse people into the organization. But it's a complicated thing, culture. What is it? Is it okay to define it in detail or not?
I'm just interested in asking, how many people over 50 have you asked?
Have we asked? What have you asked?
How many people over 50 have you asked?
Do you understand that?
How many people over
what?
50 have we asked what the culture is?
Thank you.
I would have to say not many in our company. We've got a very young organisation. So I would say probably people over 50 typically tend to be a lot of our senior leaders or executives. It's a pretty small portion of the company. I think my previous company was the same. When I started, the average age at Dropbox is 27 years old. Yeah. But we do certainly see, when we run an engagement survey every couple of months, and we do definitely, wherever we can, split that by demographics, and we do definitely see differences in terms of how people perceive the culture, perceive the work, all of those kinds of things. And so we think a lot about how we can be more inclusive and flexible in the way that we lead, the way that we teach, so that we can actually be inclusive of different generations. But it's a challenge.
Indeed. Any other questions from the floor? Regina, what's your question?
Well, it's a culture question. Going back, thank you. It's a culture question, and again, going back, and I'm really, really excited about talking to you because you're so much younger. Okay, so I went through several corporate mergers back in the day. Just about every small company in Silicon Valley was out there to be on the block, so to speak, to be bought out. So I've been part of two mergers. One was they were all American companies, but there was one that was an American small company bought out by another large American company. And then there was a second one in Silicon Valley, which was an American company bought out by a German company. And as an employee, knowing nothing about corporate mergers, we experienced cultures. We had to learn how this is biotechnology, so we had to learn how Germans did science versus how Americans did science. Fortunately, I was educated in New Zealand. So my scientific understanding was very close to the German scientific understanding, so they kind of liked me. But I could see that there was a lot of cultural, technical differences between how the Europeans thought and how the Americans thought. Americans back then, let's get the product on the market, quick, be the first out there. Germans were like, let's step back, let's do an extra data point, we don't want any problems. I'm wondering what the climate is today in that arena.
Yeah, I think a lot of learning has been taken from. I agree. Many years ago, it used to be much more around working internationally, across cultures, things like that. I think all of that has come much closer now. So you will have people from all sorts of different countries that you're working with, totally different styles. So I think what the strategy has been around that is starting from a place of actually how we interact in every interaction, the way we train managers to connect with direct reports. Everything is coming from a place of questioning, what do you value? How do you like to communicate? So because it can also be problematic in terms of you look at German culture or whatever, and you have stereotypes about how to work with particular cultures. So I think we're trying to get to a point of just being curious, everyone you work with, to understand how they want to be treated, how do they want to be communicated with, etc.
Great, thanks, Emma. So we've just about run out of time, so I've got one burning question. Is that we invited you onto this panel because you have stood out in such a VUCA, a disruptive world. So if you were to leave the audience with one piece of advice about how to survive and thrive in this world, what would it be? Amar, would you like to go first?
Sure. One piece of advice perhaps is, there's a quote which is often attributed to Churchill, but I don't know if it's true because it's disputed in some books. It's that success is a constant. So success is going from one failure to another with no loss of excitement. That would be my one advice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So is that about keeping your excitement and passion alive?
Yeah, it basically comes from a place, especially in this, I guess to use the word disruptive place. I think there's going to be failures every single day. Small ones, large ones, it doesn't matter. But I think success is very much about keeping that excitement going.
That's great. What a great thought. Emma, how about you?
I think mine also comes from my a bit of my being a Kiwi as well, in terms of my style. I always think just be courageous. There is so much that is not said in organizations. It's so much that is not made transparent. Be that person to call out the elephant in the room, really push people, bring transparency. If there's and I always particularly my role, but I think always the way I function, as I love to be that person. Like if I ever think, oh, I notice there's that tension with this person, or that's not happening because of this, I go there. I always want to go there. I'm not saying be a jerk, because I think you've got to have the trust. You've got to, you need to come from a place of positive intent. But if you can do it in that way, you have a lot of permission to challenge, and it brings a lot of value to organisations.
That's great. I love that. Being direct, but doing it in a really positive, solutions-focused way. Well, look, I've found this discussion quite thought-provoking, and I hope you have as well. So please join me in thanking Emma and Amar. So just to sum up the evening, I think what's really stood out for me from everything that we've heard tonight is that if we are going to ignite a spirit of innovation, it really comes down to the people. And it's about what do we find passionate for ourselves? What is that thing that we want to go after and give all our energy and our time and our commitment? And then also, what is it that we inspire and infect others to do? And I think certainly as we go along in our careers, we have a duty to be leaders and to think about what is it that we are passing on through other generations of people who are going to come after us. And ultimately, I think what you say about asking that question, getting the elephant out of the room onto the table, and really, as you said too, Amar, about going after what excites you every day, those are the things that will really drive through innovation and I think start to make a real difference. So thank you very much for coming along tonight. We've got more networking and drinks after, so I look forward to meeting you all after we finish this part. Thank you.